Hello everybody, it is June 7, 2020, time's about 11:30 CDT. It's about 77 degrees Fahrenheit out. It is Geo-Rant time, number 129. But before I get into all this, there's a couple things I need to talk about. First of all, I'm going to make any corrections to the previous Geo-Rants in the next one, so 128 in this case. And I'm going to do that first. So in that at 8:45, I also put it in the description too, any corrections, but no one ever reads it, so I'm doing it here. I talk about open anticlines, and I meant to say plunging anticlines and plunging synclines, okay? That was my bad. Basically, this is an anticline. This is your flat level bed. It gets deformed. Anticline, this is an open anticline. This would be an open syncline. The axis trend is open at the ends, okay? Plunging ones are sometimes open, but not necessarily. They don't have to be, but they can be open. But what happens is they plunge into the earth. All right, this is a plunging anticline. This is a plunging syncline. They can technically be open, so I guess I wasn't totally wrong, but I meant plunging. Now we have closed anticlines too. They would be, where there's, instead of this, where there's open ends, you have it's closed all around. This is a dome, also a dome. We also have closed synclines, which would be a basin. And technically, the Baraboo quartzite, which has been deformed into a syncline, the spoon-shaped syncline, technically is a basin. All right. Something else I want to talk about. My geo-rants are supposed to be less technical. Generally, for people beginning in geology or interested in geology, the real technical stuff is supposed to be the geophiles. And I've been getting too technical, so I'm going to pull back. And today I'm going to talk about the North American Stratigraphic Code, and specifically the part about lithostratigraphy. I am not going to give you article numbers, paragraphs, or sections. It is linked below in the description if you want to read the most recent version. The document is not that long, but we are going to deal with the part on lithostratigraphy. All right, and we'll just say this is a little cross-section into the earth of our area. Now, in order to, the basic building block when we name geologic units, North American Stratigraphic Code is about naming units. In lithostratigraphy, which means you name rocks based off lithology, the rock type. It's independent of unconformities. We'll say there's an unconformity here, an unconformity here. I mean, you can use unconformities as boundaries, but you don't need to. And it's also time independent. All right, so say this is Precambrian, and this is Cambrian, and we have Cambrian fossils up to about here, and then we're into the Ordovician. All right, this could still all be one lithostratigraphic unit, well, except for this, but that's just there's your basement rock. All right, so it's about to get real confusing, but first I need to talk about something. The formation, like I said, is the basic geologic unit. It's what you usually see on maps, all right? And it has to be mappable. Well, what is mappable? Well, a formation, which is the core unit, here is a map done, 15 years ago now, by some colleagues. And this is a 7.5 minute quadrangle, scale 1 to 24,000. Okay, these are common, and in this area in the Midwest, this is a good scale to use. So if a unit's mappable on this, it could be named as a formation. And here are the geologic units. This is your strat column here, okay, and those are your type of structures there. And there's your scale down there, so it tells you how big it is. Roughly in this area, at this latitude, these things are about the size of a township. They're a little bigger, okay? So that'll give you a square township, not like the weird townships you see out east and up north in the UP, all right? But it doesn't only have to be mappable on the surface. That's a surface, that's like an aerial view. It can be mappable in the subsurface, like in a cross-section as well, right? But how do you determine that? Honestly, it's a judgment call, okay? Say this is 1 meter or 3 meters here, so about 10 feet here. And then over here, it's 3 times as thick. And say there's a state line here. In this state, this could be a formation, and here it could be a member of this. All right. If you're in a level area where there's not a lot of faults, synclines, anticlines, that kind of stuff, not a lot of deformation, and not a lot of topography. If this is exposed at the surface, that's mappable, even though it's not that thick. Okay, so that could legitimately be its own formation. All right, it depends. It's really a judgment call. There's nothing that sits there and says a unit has to be more than 3 meters or 10 feet thick to be its own formation. Nothing exists like that. And I'm using the North American Stratigraphic code. There's an international one, but honestly, the international one came from this one. This one was first. And I'm in North America. I'm a North American, so I'm using this one, okay? And this is the one we generally use here, all right? So it may or may not be mappable at the surface or the subsurface or whatever. It really is a judgment call. But for the sake of argument in this cross section, we are going to say that this right here is about 3 meters or 10 feet. Okay? That's just going to be what we're going to say. Okay? And we'll say we're within the same state or province, whatever, it doesn't matter. It applies to the whole of North America. Okay, so because a lot of times you cross state lines or provincial lines, things will change names, or it'll be like I said, this could be a formation one and a member in another state. You know, this is the way that is because that stuff was left up to the states and provinces a long time ago, and the North American Stratigraphic Code, the first version, came out in the 80s. So we've got basically before that 150 years of people naming stuff in a kind of ad hoc way. And there were some sort of unsaid standards. First of all, if something is named, like the St. Peter sandstone was named after the St. Peter River, that river changed its name. We don't change the name of the sandstone. It's still the St. Peter, okay? So you do that. There is a precedence thing, you know, the older name tends to stay if you change. I'm not going to get into changing or redefining units. I do that a lot, actually. But we're not going to talk about that here. So what's this stuff? Well, in geology, when you name a formation or a member or a tongue or a lens or some sort of formal unit, you can name anything you want informally. You can call this the X sandstone. That's not a formal designation. That's just an informal designation. Doesn't matter if you capitalize the S or not. And just because you call this the X formation doesn't make it a legitimate lithostratigraphic unit. There is a process to this, okay? Well, that's a talk for another time as well. We're just going to deal with how you name things in the subsurface. So you have your formation, all right? And there are numerous ways you can divide this, okay? So I look at this, we'll say this is unknown. It's not exposed anywhere in the area, all right? That's not presently known. We'll get to that in a little bit. But these names up here, what are these? You have to name things in geology after semi-permanent to permanent features. You cannot name this the Sylvester sandstone because that was your favorite cat. This isn't biology. We don't do things that, and it's not mineralogy. You don't just make it sound Latin or slap an "ite" at the end of it as you would mineralogy, and you can't name it anything you want. Has to be semi-permanent features, and if they change names, oh well, they change names. Stuff happens. But the reason why we use semi-permanent to permanent features is because they're less likely to change names. Stuff like this. And there is like the Brandon, this is Beetle Bridge. I just made these up. I pulled these out of my hindsight. But there is a member in the Joliet Formation, which is Silurian in Illinois, called the Brandon Bridge member. It's named after a bridge. That was done many, many, many moons ago. I think back in the 60s. So 1960s. So it's stuck and it's fine. You can still use it, but you generally want to avoid this kind of stuff because these things are more likely to change name. I mean, businesses close, okay? Highways often change names or are removed from the area. Plus, you don't want something like this because US 30 goes nationally, all right? Same thing with like I-80, you know, Interstate 80, something like that, or Trans-Canada 17. You want local or semi-local names, and honestly in areas like Northern Ontario those names are hard to come by, you know, but you generally pull them from a topographic map. That's where you pull them from, okay? If this was a school like Ponder School, that was something people used to do, but that's generally just, you don't do that anymore, okay? And you want to avoid repetition of names, so these we're not even going to use. They're not legitimate, so we have these, okay? Nowadays, you want to drop the suffixes or the prefixes. They aren't necessary. You also want to avoid repetition of names, even if they're not local. Like if there's a blocker formation, it says say we're in say we're in Wisconsin here, but there's a blocker formation in California, we probably won't want to use this one. All right, it's local, and and it's not against the code technically, but it's just something you want to avoid. And now there is a bank of names being used on the U.S. side, so you can avoid that in detail. But anyway, even if these are all fair game, you want to drop stuff like this. Okay? They aren't necessary, although traditionally they have been included on some. Like the Brandon Bridge member. It's just a Brandon member. Would have been fine. But, different time, different things. So we don't rename things just to rename things. That's a no-no. All right? So what are we going to do with this cross-section at this scale? We'll say this is vertically exaggerated. We'll say this is like, I don't know. This is like 1.5 kilometers, which is roughly 1 mile. Okay? So it's somewhat extensive. In our quadrangle, this stuff's mappable. Okay? Like I said, we don't have to worry about unconformities, although we can use them. This is a virgin area. Nothing's been named. We're going to assume that. Okay? No deformation. It's pretty much like this throughout the quadrangle. What would I do? Well, this could all be one formation. All right? And I could divide it out into members, and in this case that would be appropriate because we have a dolostone here, a sandstone here, a shale here, and a conglomerate here, which we are unaware of yet. This we're going to ignore. This is our basement rock, and this we'll say this has already been named for something 50 miles away as the Carton granite. Okay. Now, when you're naming things lithologically, you can use things like, if you were to use blocker here, you could say the blocker dolostone. Or if it was a limestone, blocker limestone, if you're naming at the formation level. But you don't have to. You can just call it the blocker formation. And that's pretty much what people do now anyway. We don't usually sit there and name it at the dominant lithology like we used to. Although you can. It's fine. And that's at the formation level. If you were to divide this into members have to be, name each one of these individual members. They have to be parts of a single formation. Members cannot cross formations or groups or anything like that. Okay? And they would be named this would be the blocker member, not the blocker dolostone member, just the blocker member, okay? So that's a subset of formation, and formations can be put into groups and supergroups, but they don't have to be. Okay? That's not necessary. And one state might have a group with a bunch of formations, but in the state next door, the lithology is sneakily taken as one formation, or it's group undivided or formation undivided. So anyway, but how would I divide this within my quadrangle? There's a couple ways I could do it. Like I said, I could make this all one formation, but I don't want to do that. I think this is lithostratigraphically significant, and say I do know that outside the quadrangle, all this stuff thickens, and this does eventually pinch out, except for this. This will pinch out, okay? But all this stuff thickens, and this we're unaware of, okay? So this stuff gets thicker, this gets thicker. It would be appropriate to name these two separate formations, and we'll say we're going to call this the Allenville Formation. We could call it the Allenville Sandstone, but we're not going to. And we'll call this the Stiles Shale or Formation. Those are now out of the pot. I cannot reuse those. They are taken. But there's this here. All right? These tongues. I could name these individual tongues as parts of these formations. Like I could name this the Beacon Tongue and this the Teapot Tongue or something like that. Or vice versa for this. But if there's no reason to do so, and that's not necessary, you shouldn't do that. Like if we had an ore here or something that's economically viable, maybe. Or if it was glacial deposits and these tongues are significant and they propagate through, that might be different. But here it's not necessary. So how do we do this? Well, we've already named these two formations And we have decided that, these are their names right there. We are unaware of this. It's on top of this. Like I said, we're unaware of the conglomerate, so we're just going to sit there and put it there right now. Okay, so we're working with this, but we have two separate formations. You just draw a vertical boundary between the two. Okay? That is acceptable. And when you make your description, here the Allenville Formation, you would sit there and say, to the west, we'll just say that this way is west. As you progress west, it becomes the Stiles Formation where the shale dominates over the sandstone. It's as simple as that, or vice versa. As you're going east, the Stiles Formation gives way to the Allenville Formation when the sandstone dominates over the shale. Okay? So that's what we call a vertical boundary. I am personally not a fan of these, but this doesn't really happen too much. And when it does, for mapping purposes, you can do that. But if you do cross section, it's totally acceptable to put this in there. If you know where they are, you can still do that in a cross section. Okay. Now I have this up here. Well, it's kind of by itself, and since nothing's named, and we know it pinches out to the east but thickens this way, we can name this a formation as well. We are going to name this the Beacon Formation. Oh, that's out. You cannot reuse that name now, okay? Even though it pinches out, because geologic units do that. They pinch in and out. Nothing continues forever. Just like unconformities do not continue forever and conformities do not continue forever, geologic units do not continue forever. Okay, so we're doing it this way. And then somebody comes in and they put a bunch of wells in. They put wells in here, they put wells in, they hit this conglomerate. Oh, crap, And it will say they have enough wells where it's decently defined. Wow. Now all of a sudden there's this basal conglomerate that nobody knew about. So how do we handle that? Well, we could make it a member of one of these formations, but there's a problem with that. You see that it's under both formations. There's another way you can handle this. You can call it a lens. Like you can formalize tongues, because these two intertongue. You can also formalize lenses. But there's a better way to handle it. Since it's at the most 10 to 12 feet thick, we can call it a bed. Beds do not have to be a part of a single member or formation. They can laterally cross units, and in this case it does. So, we're going to call this the teapot bed. And we'll say we are naming it because it's significant because there's copper in there or something, or a little bit of hematite in there that's potentially economically viable. All right. But you don't want to, and the bed kind of gives us an out too. If this thing isn't a lens like we think it is, say it extends further in an that helps us. Just calling it a bed in this case. So, that was a lot longer than I wanted that to be. Like I said, this is a complicated thing. And the North American Stratigraphic Code, there's an international stratigraphic code which is totally based off of this. Okay? And it's very similar to this. So, me being in North America, I use this one. So, in lithostratigraphy, lithostratigraphic units are usually what you're going to see on geologic maps. Unless you start zooming out, like, you get 1 to 1 million scale. So somebody might map all the Cambrian together or something like that and just undivided, even though they may be divided officially at the 7.5 quad angle. So it's just a way, it's a mapping thing. It depends on the scale of your map too. You're not going to be able to map, if you're using 1 in 1 million scale, you're not going to be able to map a 3-meter bed at the surface very effectively, especially if it's tilted nearly vertical. All right. So anyway, that's it. Oh man, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and I hope you learned something.